Just after World War I ended, the Austrian writer and journalist Karl Kraus asked this question: how was the world led to war? His answer was, diplomats lie to journalists, and the diplomats believe those lies when they see them in print.
Ira Basen is a longtime CBC radio producer who spent the last decade reading, writing, teaching, and broadcasting about political spin and mass persuasion.
And the more I studied this, the more I was struck by how much of it loops back to World War I.
I'm Paul Kennedy, and this week on Ideas, we're marking the centenary of the war that was to end all wars with a special series of programs.
Let me repeat that statement. Diplomats lie to journalists, and the diplomats believe those lies when they see them in print.
Ira Basen's documentary is called World War I and the Birth of Public Relations, and it begins much closer to our own day.
Now keep that statement in mind about diplomats lying to journalists as you listen to former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney speaking on NBC's Meet the Press in September 2002.
There's a story in the New York Times this morning, and I want to attribute to the Times. I don't want to talk about, obviously, specific intelligence sources, but it's now public.
At the time, the Bush administration was trying to solidify the case for war against Saddam Hussein.
It's now public that, in fact, he has been seeking to acquire, and we have been able to intercept and prevent him from acquiring the kinds of tubes that are necessary to build a centrifuge, and the centrifuge is required.
The vice president's appearance on the program followed a report in that morning's New York Times. Anonymous intelligence sources had told the paper that Saddam Hussein was getting closer to making weapons of mass destruction.
We read in the New York Times today a story that says that Saddam Hussein is closer to acquiring nuclear weapons. Does he have nuclear weapons?
There were several problems with that Times story. The first is, it wasn't true. The second is that the White House knew it wasn't true. The so-called anonymous sources behind the story were actually members of the Bush administration itself. So follow the bouncing ball here. The vice president went on the air that day quoting a false story that they themselves had leaked to a compliant reporter. But they made it sound as if that information, which of course supported their case for war, was coming from an independent source. Diplomats tell lies to journalists, and they start to believe those lies when they see them in print.
It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there.
This is just one of many techniques of mass persuasion that were developed during the Great War. And 100 years later, reporters are still being lied to, those lies are still being printed, and soldiers are still marching off to war because of them. Unlike Canada, the United States didn't enter the war in August 1914. Public opinion was solidly against American participation.
10 million soldiers to the war have gone, who may never return again.
In fact, one of the most popular songs of the time was actually an anti-war song that tried to rally American mothers against the war effort.
I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier.
The sentiments expressed in that song were widely shared in the U.S. between 1914 and 1917. They even found a sympathetic ear in the White House, where President Woodrow Wilson favored the British cause. But he was urging Americans to be neutral in thought and deed. His campaign for re-election in 1916 used the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But by the end of that year, the president had changed his mind. German attacks on American ships and a concern that the war might indeed be lost had convinced him that America needed to get involved.
Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty.
So in April 1917, President Wilson signed the declaration of war. But he needed to get Americans to change course too.
Tell your sweetheart not to mind, be proud her boys in line.
He is facing what you might call a public relations problem.
Stuart Ewan is a professor at Hunter College in New York and the author of PR, A Social History of Spin.
A war that has been defined as a capitalist war. A war that is defined as far away and not our business. And a war that is coming under attack from a lot of, say, academics, intellectuals. So basically what happens is that he decides that in order to execute the war militarily, that it would be necessary to execute the war propagandistically.
What are we fighting for? Remember that you American men and women give your sons to no ordinary war, though outwardly it be war and nothing more. Remember that America is not in war for the sake of war.
Before 1917, the U.S. had waged war against its northern and southern neighbors and had fought the Spanish in Cuba and the Philippines. But sending American troops onto European soil was something entirely different. This war would have to be sold to the American public.
Your sons have taken up arms not to slay, but to bring the hope of unbroken life to countless generations unborn.
This wasn't a war for territory or to support the old imperialist order.
It is not too late to save the world, to rebuild an order of life that shall be just and righteous altogether.
This was a war to vanquish a brutal tyrant and export America's progressive values to oppressed people everywhere. Sound familiar?
To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
Like World War I, the Iraq War was supposed to make the world safe for democracy.
We will pass through this time of peril. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail.
Of course, there are obvious differences between how and why America entered World War I and the war in Iraq, but there are many crucial parallels as well.
There's definitely a new version of this overarching message that this is a war between civilization and barbarism.
Susan Brewer is an historian and the author of the book Why America Fights: Patriotism and War Propaganda from the Philippines to Iraq.
And definitely a war in which the Americans see themselves as protecting innocent people, as spreading freedom, as projecting democracy against an evil, brutal regime. So I think that good versus evil message is definitely repackaged for the Iraq War. There's also a very strong combination, again, of propaganda and censorship that really, I think, helped to shape the way Americans at home saw what was happening.
On the land, on the sea, in the air, everywhere will warfare. Every mother's son, a soldier with a gun upon his shoulder will be there to his care. First in peace,
For President Wilson, selling his war would require building a propaganda machine on a scale never before seen. A few days after entering the war in April 1917, the president established something called the Committee on Public Information, or CPI. His mandate was to take an American public that was largely indifferent or hostile to the war and turn it around, quickly and completely. Remember that anti-war song that was so popular before America declared war? The one about mothers not raising their boys to be soldiers. Well, America was singing a different tune after April 1917.
It's time for every boy to be a soldier, to put his strength and courage to the test. It's time to place a musket on his shoulder and wrap the stars and stripes around his breast.
The Committee on Public Information brought together many of the brightest minds in advertising, journalism, graphic design, academia, and a fledgling new industry called public relations. By the end of the war, more than 100,000 Americans had contributed to the CPI's propaganda efforts. They created Uncle Sam and other iconic recruiting images, churned out millions of photographs and posters.
It is simply a question now of the survival of autocracy or democracy.
They also enlisted local notables known as 4-Minute Men to deliver carefully crafted 4-minute inspirational orations in church halls, movie theaters, and anywhere that Americans gathered.
They are in their death grapple. It is a fight to the finish, and it is up to us.
Wilson's choice to lead the committee was a surprising one. George Creel was a prominent progressive muckraking journalist famous for campaigning for child labor laws, clean government, and an end to corporate corruption. Now he'd be responsible for making sure reporters towed the government's line when it came to reporting the war. The CPI was given broad powers to ban publications that it felt posed a threat to the war effort. Yet what was really unprecedented about the CPI was not how it censored the news, but how it managed it.
Creel felt that the reporting tradition in Washington was to just sort of hang around and, talk to political leaders as they were coming in and out of their offices and just get quotations. And Creel was worried not just about what the reporters would find out, but what some senator might say or somebody at the War Department might say, which would end up being the feature of the news story. And Creel felt that that would not best reflect the government's version of what it wanted to come out. So he decided to take over and coordinate all of that and prevent the more haphazard, casual, hit and miss kind of reporting that was traditional at the time. So it was a way to really dominate the version of the war that came through the news media.
The job of making sure the government's message dominated news coverage fell to the CPI's Division of News. It wasn't just a clearinghouse for all war information, it was the primary source of war news. It sent its representatives into government departments and agencies to write press releases and arrange interviews. They would also ensure that the vast quantities of official proclamations, speeches, and statistics were distributed to newspapers and magazines. By the end of the war, the committee had issued 6,000 press releases in English. Although no one was compelled to print any of it, almost every newspaper and magazine in the country made extensive use of material generated by the CPI. No wonder the New York Times labeled World War I the first press agents' war. An important precedent was being set that would ultimately transform American journalism. It was way easier to accept handouts and turn them into news than to do original reporting. It would prove to be a hard habit to break after the fighting stopped. Michael Schudson teaches journalism at Columbia University.
At the time, as it often happens with wars, we think the war ends and we go back to regular life. But that's never what happens. And part of not going back to regular life after 1918 is that a lot of people had learned public relations during the war, and a lot of people in positions of power recognized that that was of some value to them. So they hired people. They hired people who'd earned their first stripes in the war as purveyors of propaganda, and suddenly hospitals and universities and corporations and government would hire PR people. If you go back to the early 1900s, a decade or so before the war, I think it was the Agriculture Department had intended to hire some public relations people, and there was a great to-do about it. Why would you do that? I mean, it was something of a scandal that the government would hire anyone to provide public information. Well, it wasn't a scandal by 1920. It had become common everyday occurrence.
Government and corporate PR flacks and their press releases may have been an everyday occurrence by the 1920s, but not all journalists were happy to see them. In 1927, a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch named Silas Bent wrote a book called Ballyhoo, The Voice of the Press. It was a lament for the sorry state of journalism in post-war America.
The war's unrestricted, corrupt influence has misdirected the energies of the American press and deformed its output. Newspapermen learned to accept uncomplainingly any handout that came from a government source. After the war was over, the swarm of press agents multiplied, and the habit of accepting handouts with docility crystallized. More and more of the stuff appearing in the news columns has come to be stuff prepared outside newspaper circles and accepted at second hand.
U.S. officials say that U.S. officials here say these officials here.
Pentagon officials tell us.
According to U.S. intelligence,
U.S. officials tell CNN. Bush officials.
Today, the bonds between the Washington Press Corps and their official government sources seem tighter than ever, especially when the drums of war start beating. In 2006, I interviewed Helen Thomas, the dean of the Washington Press Corps, who died a couple of years ago. When I talked to her, she was 86 years old and had covered every president since John F. Kennedy. She was never one to accept a government handout quietly, and she was one of the Bush administration's strongest critics during the run-up to the war in Iraq. And her anger wasn't just directed at the White House.
The press corps failed to ask the questions they should have asked, like why and what do you mean, where's the proof of the weapons and so forth. They bought it, every hook, line, and sinker. They became stenographers, lapdogs. And I think that there was trepidation on the part of the reporters that felt that maybe their bosses would not want them to be too challenging or rock the boat. There was definitely an onus, a shadow cast on the press to play ball. And nobody really wanted to step out of line. And when you did, every reason they gave could have been challenged, and it wasn't. The press went into a coma. And they were gung-ho to go to war.
For 4 days now, they have been taking incoming fire from this group of buildings you can see through the mist there. It was once a hospital, it is now an Iraqi command center.
Today marks the third day of our road march toward Baghdad. Last night, Iraqi soldiers tried to sneak into our convoy. The big guns like this one unloaded on them. The soldiers here tell us there were no prisoners to be found.
Reporters going gung-ho for war isn't new. Media is, by and large, a business, not a public service. And when readers, advertisers, and governments start demanding war, you won't find many publishers brave enough to rock the boat. And World War I posed some unique challenges. The first modern war produced horrors on a level never before seen. Keeping news of those horrors out of the newspapers became a priority for every government involved in the conflict. In December 1917, after hearing an account of conditions on the front lines, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George said, "If people really knew, the war would be stopped tomorrow. But of course, they don't know and can't know. The correspondents don't write, and the censors would not pass the truth." In Britain and the United States, where there was already a tradition of independent journalism, many reporters resisted efforts to suppress the truth of what was happening on the battlefield. But in Canada, not so much.
In Canada, I don't think that we had that level of professionalism or that level of sophistication in the press, or at least the press was not presenting themselves in that way.
Jeff Keshin is the author of the book Propaganda and Censorship During Canada's Great War.
In fact, you have the publisher, for example, of the Montreal Mail writing the chief press censor to say, well, don't worry if our journalists are coming over because they're going to be a constructive player in the process. And I also think this comes from the fact that a lot of these newspaper journalists in this early stage of the profession were really coming not from journalism schools where they were taught sort of the standards of the trade, but they're coming from much different backgrounds where they look at themselves as being craftsmen, as being writers, and as being, I think, advocates for not just the cause of war, but for the cause of imperialism. So we have a different sort of dynamic at play there where newspaper reporters would be advocating themselves as contributing to the war effort, as writing those stories that would engage the population and help rally them to a cause in which everybody said that they shared.
When the Great War ended, few Canadian reporters had any cause for regret. They'd done their duty for king and country. Elsewhere, it was a different story. Many of the characteristics of modern war coverage, from manufactured stories to embedded reporters, are legacies of the First World War. Never before had the full power of the state been mobilized in an attempt to mold public opinion. Never before had a free press been asked to use its powers of persuasion and stake its credibility in support of the government's propaganda machine. In the end, it was not a performance for the press to be proud of. One British historian wrote that there was no more discreditable period in the history of journalism than the 4 years of the Great War. But in the United States, the legacy was more ambiguous. On the plus side, the Committee on Public Information lifted the veil of secrecy that had traditionally hung over the way nations conduct war. Americans were given access to more accurate government information than ever before. But they were also inundated with more government propaganda than ever before, and it became increasingly difficult to tell the difference. Propaganda disguised as news was the cheapest and most effective way for governments to manipulate public opinion. Many of the 100,000 Americans who had contributed to the CPI's propaganda efforts learned some of the rudimentary tools of the new art of political persuasion. One of them was journalist Will Irwin. In 1936, he wrote a book called Propaganda and the News.
The world struggle of 1914 to 1918, which saw an unprecedented advance in the art of large-scale dying, saw an equally rapid advance in that of large-scale lying. Governments had proved that the press could be gagged and the news slanted, biased, or juggled to produce almost any temporary effect they wished, and that, in time of war at least, people would endure the process. Here was a weapon of statesmanship too useful to abandon in a time of peace.
The combination of a cooperative press and the extraordinary propaganda efforts of the CPI got the results the Wilson administration wanted: a swift turnaround in American public opinion about the war. It only took 6 months for that initial indifference and hostility to disappear. It was replaced by what George Creel liked to call the white heat of patriotism.
This was a war of unprecedented gruesomeness.
Mark Crispin Miller is a professor of media studies at New York University.
This was nothing like the chivalric fantasy of riding off on your charger with a lance. But the propaganda used that kind of language when in fact the war was a meat grinder, the likes of which had never been seen before. Well, in both cases, in both Britain and the United States, the propaganda was vastly successful. It was based on a very thorough foundation of censorship, so that none of the truths about what that war was really like or about why it was really being fought could interfere with the official fantasy. And on that foundation of censorship, there was a relentless and ubiquitous barrage of stimuli, all hammering home the point that the Germans were subhuman, they were the Huns, they were backward. This was a war to protect civilization from barbarians. The Germans were accused of all manner of atrocities that had mostly been invented primarily by British propagandists. In the United States, Woodrow Wilson set up a committee on public information, and the euphemism is significant. We never used the word propaganda to refer to our own propaganda. We used the word propaganda only to refer to anything and everything that the other side had to say or do. We inform, we educate, we correct the record, they make propaganda.
You're listening to World War I and the Birth of Public Relations on Ideas, heard on CBC.ca, Sirius XM, and of course on CBC Radio 1. I'm Paul Kennedy. Ira Basen has been thinking about political spin and techniques of mass persuasion for the last decade. His documentary is part of a week-long series Ideas is featuring on the centenary of the Great War.
One of the most effective atrocity stories circulated by British and American propagandists was that the Germans boiled the bodies of their own dead soldiers in giant rendering plants to make lubricants and fertilizers. It wasn't until 1925 that a British intelligence officer admitted that he was responsible for circulating that false story. Atrocity stories have long been a staple of wartime propaganda. In World War I, there were real atrocities unfolding on the battlefield on a scale never before seen, and an unprecedented level of made-up atrocities reported in the press and displayed on posters.
We're all brought up to think that, and rightly so, that killing is wrong. So you have to get people in a mentality where they are willing to kill, and you do that by dehumanizing the enemy. The enemy is not a real human being in your eyes. The enemy is just that, the incarnation of an enemy.
Randall Marlin believes modern warfare can't be effectively sold to the public without ratcheting up the hatred of the enemy. He's in the philosophy department at Carleton University and the author of the book Propaganda and the Ethics of Persuasion.
And George Orwell describes that beautifully when he's fighting the fascists. He had a fascist in his sight, and then he was going to pull the trigger, and then he saw that this fascist had a really human problem. His pants were falling down because a button was gone, and when he saw that this was a human being, he couldn't fire. So that's one of the aims of war propaganda, is to dehumanize the enemy, make it easy for people to kill and think they're doing good.
There's nothing that dehumanizes an enemy faster than stories about the mistreatment of babies. One of the most dramatic images to come out of World War I was a widely circulated poster of a German soldier with a baby impaled on the tip of his bayonet. That image had been created by British propagandists, and you can see it on our website at cbc.ca/ideas. There never was any evidence that German soldiers actually stabbed babies with their bayonets. But the truth wasn't really the point. Nor was it the point 75 years later when we heard this story about enemy soldiers killing babies.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
Her name was Naira. At least, that was the name she used when she testified in front of a congressional committee in October 1990.
The Iraqis were making fun of President Bush and verbally and physically abusing my family and me on our way out of Kuwait.
At the time, the administration of George H.W. Bush was trying to get a reluctant American population to support military action against Iraq, after Iraq had invaded neighboring Kuwait.
The Iraqis dunked his head into a swimming pool until he almost drowned.
Stories of Iraqi soldiers throwing babies out of incubators were almost guaranteed to help turn American public opinion around, especially when that message was constantly being reinforced by politicians
whose troops have bayoneted pregnant women and have ripped babies from their incubators in Kuwait,
including the president himself.
Kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
But several months after Congress had voted for war against Iraq, it was revealed that the whole incubator baby story was false.
I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country.
Nayira was in fact a member of the Kuwaiti royal family. She wasn't even there when the incident allegedly occurred. And in fact, there never was any evidence that babies had been removed from their incubators. The whole scheme had been cooked up by the PR firm Hill and Knowlton, whose client was the Kuwaiti royal family. The family and the firm hoped to drum up support for the war by portraying Iraqi soldiers as baby-killing monsters. Substitute Iraqi for German, and you get the picture. The strategy came straight from American and British propagandists of the First World War.
Let's bury the hatchet, let's bury the hatchet, let's bury the hatchet in the Kaiser's head. We'll crown him on the noodle, make him whistle Yankee Doodle, shouting the battle cry of Wilson.
Dehumanizing the enemy is useful for propaganda purposes, but once those forces are unleashed, they can be hard to reel in. And no one understood that better than the man who ran the Committee on Public Information, George Creel. In his post-war memoir, Creel boasted that the CPI was so confident in its case that no argument was needed other than the simple, straightforward presentation of facts. We wanted to reach people through their minds rather than through their emotions, he wrote. But he also wrote this about what he believed the committee was actually about. It was a plain publicity proposition, a vast enterprise in salesmanship, the world's greatest adventure in advertising. Now, as a former newspaperman, George Creel knew better than most that publicity, salesmanship, and advertising were often inconsistent with the straightforward presentation of facts. He would try to walk the fine line between informing the public and manipulating it.
What the agency started out as was essentially a press agency.
Stuart Ewan.
But this was a period of time where anti-war feeling continued. And so if, in fact, the Committee on Public Information started out as something that was predicated on the idea of pumping out factual definitions of truth, very quickly people on the inside begin to start arguing that the way in which we are going to build support for this war is not going to be by pumping out facts, but we need to begin to start to appeal to the emotional lives, to the fears and the anxieties and the concerns that lurk beneath the surface of consciousness. And so there was this sort of notion that you don't want people, dickering over facts. Let's just bypass that part of the mental process and let's just go right to the gut. And so increasingly, you begin to have the emergence of a kind of public rhetoric, which I think more than any time before it creates a dividing line between fact and emotional appeal. And so if at first it's journalists and people who know how to package journalism who sort of rule the day in the CPI, very quickly it becomes illustrators, advertising people, publicists. They get brought together into this thing, and more the kind of stuff that's coming out of the CPI is stuff which is designed to provoke fear.
Uncle Sam is calling now. one of you. If you're too old or young to fight, there's something else to do. What are you going to do for Uncle Sammy? What are you going to do to help the boy? If you meet to stay at home, the least that you can do is buy a Liberty Bond or two. If you're going...
After America entered the war in April 1917, it quickly became apparent that vast amounts of money were needed to finance the war effort. The Wilson administration decided to ask Americans to help pay for the war by loaning the government money. The task of getting people to subscribe to these Liberty loans fell to the CPI's Division of Advertising. They blanketed the country with posters and advertisements. Now, these ads could have just focused on dollars and cents. Instead, they showed things like German officers chopping off the hands of a boy while other officers were choking his mother.
If you're going to be a sympathetic miser, the kind that only lends a lot of noise, you're no better than the one who loves the Kaiser. So, what are you going to do to help the boy?
They took that approach because these CPI publicists were convinced that appeals to the intellect wouldn't work, largely because they believed there just wasn't much intellect to appeal to. Daniel Robinson teaches media studies at the University of Western Ontario.
You had the Committee on Public Information. You had within that subcommittees that would deal with advertising, that would deal with news, that would deal with pictorial publicity or posters and that sort of thing. But there were also psychologists, applied psychologists, academic psychologists involved. And their involvement had to do with things like doing intelligence testing, aptitude testing of soldiers who were enlisting. And what they found from that was a sense that overall intelligence levels were lower than they thought. This was the first instance of mass testing of people for aptitude and psychological and intelligence testing. And they found that the overall intelligence levels were low. We know now that there was an incredible amount of cultural bias in these tests, but the perception that comes out of this war is that people are not as bright as we thought they were, that this sort of collective sense of common sense, the intelligence of the average person is not what we thought it was. And so the thinking then becomes, well, how do we govern a society like this?
So how do we govern a society like this? What does it mean for democracy when opinion leaders believe that the average person just isn't all that bright? Of all the questions that came out of World War I, this was arguably the most significant, and the one that resonates most deeply 100 years later. It was a question that preoccupied two men who are little known today, but who greatly influenced 20th century American life. Both worked as propagandists for the Committee on Public Information during the war, but drew very different conclusions from their experiences. The first was Walter Lippmann, who was one of America's leading journalists and social critics. The second was Edward Bernays, who after the war became one of the founding fathers of public relations. By the time the war started, Walter Lippmann was already one of America's leading progressive public intellectuals. But by the time the war ended, he was disillusioned and despaired for the future of American democracy. His experience writing propaganda for the CPI had seriously disturbed him. It had simply been too easy to manipulate public opinion by appealing to people's baser instincts. 4 years after the war, in 1922, he wrote a deeply pessimistic book called Public Opinion.
Lippmann's argument was that public opinion was more important than ever because of changes in communication, but it was very hard to see how it could be fully and properly informed.
Jay Rosen is a professor of journalism at New York University.
After all, the world had exploded in scale. Modern problems were incredibly complex. Just look at the Great War itself and the complex causes that it had. And it was unrealistic to think that average citizens could actually know that much about public problems. Instead, their opinions were being influenced not by the information they got from the press, as classical democratic theory might have suggested, but through images and stereotypes and slogans and the packaging part of politics, the play of symbols. And that if we incorporated this into our picture of democracy, we'd have to revise that picture quite a lot. And he said that the omnicompetent citizen was a fiction and couldn't be the basis of a secure republic. And so his book was very much kind of a work of irony. It's supposed to be this way, but when you actually look at how it works, it's nothing like that.
Walter Lippmann was convinced that America could only meet the political, economic, and social challenges of the 20th century if the power currently exercised by popular majorities gave way to a new form of democracy. Critical decisions would be made by a small group of experts, the intelligent few, as he liked to call them. You could think of them as the 1%. But admission to this elite group would be based on brainpower, not wealth. They could set aside their narrow self-interest and govern for the common good. As for the public, it needed to be led, not educated. Their consent could be manufactured by people skilled in the use of images and symbols, professional persuaders like Edward Bernays.
I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace.
That's Edward Bernays from an interview he did for a BBC documentary in the 1990s when he was almost 100 years old. Bernays happened to be the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he inherited from his uncle a fascination with the unconscious mind. But while Freud was preoccupied with excavating the hidden psychic forces acting on the individual, Bernays wanted to figure out how to use them to motivate the masses. His years writing propaganda for the Committee on Public Information convinced him that if you could sell war by appealing to the heart and not the head, then you could do the same thing to sell just about anything. All he needed was a name for what he wanted to do.
Propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
Edward Bernays returned to New York after the war and set up shop as a council on public relations. His mission was to show corporate America that the way to reach consumers was by appealing to their unconscious needs and desires. And one of his first clients was the American Tobacco Company.
It was back in the 1920s, and Bernays was working for what was then the biggest tobacco company in the world, American Tobacco.
Larry Tye is the author of The Father of Spin, Edward L. Bernays and the Birth of Public Relations.
And essentially during World War I, the tobacco companies had succeeded in getting an entire generation of American men addicted to cigarettes.
Not the slacker, get a sack of good tobacco and send it to some Yankee soldier right away.
But the tobacco company was smart enough to realize that was only half of the American market. The other half was the female half, and they promised to make Bernays a very rich man if he could figure out a way to get women smoking cigarettes. And Bernays did, in that case, what he always did. He took American Tobacco's money and he went to one of Freud's disciples in America, a guy named Dr. A.A. Brill.
I went to Dr. Brill and asked him what cigarettes meant to women, and he answered very quickly, cigarettes are torches of freedom to women. They want to smoke to dramatize man's taboo against women by not permitting them to smoke. And that's why they want to smoke.
And Bernays thought that was brilliant. Normally, public relations had been trying to fill up news pages with free stories, being basically publicists. Bernays took it to a new level. He tried to understand the roots of a behavior in order to change that very behavior.
So here's how Bernays was able to do that for the cigarette company. He convinced a bunch of New York's leading debutantes to smoke cigarettes while walking down Fifth Avenue during the Easter Day parade. He persuaded them that the simple act of smoking in public would strike a blow for the emancipation of women. And oh yes, it would get lots of publicity for American tobacco. And he was right on both counts.
Next morning, there wasn't a newspaper in the United States, even the New York Times had a front page story, "Debutantes light torches of freedom to protest man's inhumanity to women by a taboo against smoking."
It was brilliant back then in terms of a marketing ploy. It is today a campaign that kids study in public relations schools all around the world, and it was Eddie Bernays and unwittingly Sigmund Freud teaming up to change a major aspect of behavior.
World War I marked an important turning point for people like Edward Bernays, who sought to manage and mobilize public opinion. They'd seen it molded in ways they hadn't previously imagined. They'd learned the power of images and symbols, and they'd begun to explore the subconscious triggers that could activate public passions. Bernays was a brilliant marketer, but his belief in his ability to manipulate behavior stemmed from a rather dark assumption about human nature.
He basically believed that people were stupid.
That's Stuart Ewan.
He doesn't have much respect for the thinking capacity of your average individual. And so what is required for the society to function is that you have an intelligent few. You know, that group of people who are intellectually viable and are able to understand things. So Bernays and Lippmann both believe that it is necessary for what Bernays calls an invisible government, the intelligent few, to basically behind the scenes guide the workings of a democracy. So that both within Bernays and Lippmann there is a total break from the kind of 18th century vision of democracy, which was predicated on people's ability to use reason, on people's ability to participate in self-government, to exercise sovereignty. There is a basic assumption that this kind of Enlightenment vision of what people were capable of was a delusion, and that in certain ways one still requires a small group of people to steer the wheels of history.
So there you have it. The next time a marketer or a politician says something so incredulous that you are compelled to ask, do they think I'm stupid? Now you know.
The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country.
Those are the opening sentences of a book called Propaganda, written by Edward Bernays in 1928. Today, when people talk about invisible governments and unseen powers, they tend to be people on the political fringes of the left or the right. But Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann were about as mainstream as you could get in post-war America. And Bernays' book wasn't a prescription for what he thought democracy should be, but a description of what he believed it had already become.
We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. It is not generally realized to what extent the words and actions of our most influential public men are dictated by shrewd persons operating behind the scenes.
It's a long way to Berlin, but we'll get there. Uncle Sam will show the way. Over the lines and across the Rhine, shouting hip hip hooray. We'll sing Yankee Doodle under the linden with some real life Yankee pep.
World War I had been sold as the war to make the world safe for democracy.
And I'm on my way by.
But in the United States, its legacy was a seriously distorted view of democracy. George Creel's greatest adventure in advertising had caused progressive thinkers like Walter Lippmann to lose faith in that central tenet of liberal democracy, the citizen's ability to reason and make rational decisions when presented with the facts. Now they would put their trust in experts. And people working behind the scenes, pulling the wires, manufacturing the consent of the masses, would play a critical role. Today, we call those people pollsters, political consultants, PR flacks, and spin doctors. Walter Lippmann predicted this exact development in 1922 in his book Public Opinion.
The practice of democracy has turned a corner. A revolution is taking place infinitely more significant than any shifting of economic power. Within the life of the generation now in control of affairs, persuasion has become a self-conscious art and a regular organ of popular government. None of us begins to understand the consequences. But it's no daring prophecy to say that the knowledge of how to create consent will alter every political calculation and modify every political premise.
We now live in the reality of Lippmann's prophecy. Democracy has indeed turned a corner. The engineers of consent are the new masters of the political universe. They obsess over communication strategies, often expending more time and energy figuring out how to sell a policy than on actually developing it. The worlds of politics and marketing have merged in ways that Edward Bernays and George Creel would surely have appreciated. When Andrew Card, Chief of Staff to George W. Bush, was asked why the administration chose September of 2002 to begin its big push for war in Iraq, he replied that, from a marketing point of view, you don't launch new products in August. Selling that war would be like selling the Great War, another vast enterprise in salesmanship, another great adventure in advertising. World War I provided a blueprint for the age of mass persuasion. We live with the consequences of that every day.
On Ideas, you've been listening to World War I and the Birth of Public Relations. The documentary was produced by Ira Basen. We've posted some images of the propaganda posters he talked about, and you can see them on our website, cbc.ca/ideas. All this week, we're featuring programs connected to World War I and how that war to end all wars helped shape how we are today. Special thanks to Ashley Walters, Jeff Goods, Richard Johnson, and David McDougall. Technical production, Dave Field. Liz Naj is the associate producer of Ideas, and Greg Kelly is the executive producer. I'm Paul Kennedy. The Hourly News is next.